June 10, 1940. Near the village of Vanques, northeastern France. The air was thick with dust and the smell of freshly turned earth. The fields around the small farming village shimmered under the early summer sun, rows of wheat swaying lazily in the wind, their golden heads oblivious to the distant thunder growing louder with every passing minute. That thunder was not from the sky. It was steel. From beyond the tree line to the east came the unmistakable groan of engines, dozens of them, the metallic roar of Panzerkampfwagen 3 tanks grinding over the roads of the Ardennes, their treads chewing through what was left of France's last lines of defense. In the village square, the remaining able-bodied men of Vanques stood gathered around an old Renault truck, faces lined with exhaustion and fear. Most were farmers. Some had seen service in the Great War, 20 years earlier. All were too old or too ill-equipped to be soldiers again. Henri Dubois, a broad-shouldered farmer of 53, stood at the center. His hands, calloused and stained from decades of tilling soil, clenched around a shovel like it was a weapon. His wife, Colette, watched from the steps of their farmhouse, her apron streaked with mud and ash. The Dubois farm sat at the edge of the village, right beside the main road, the same road the Germans would have to use to reach Reims. A French corporal, barely 20, with dust-caked boots and a half-empty rifle magazine, spoke quickly to the crowd. "They're coming. The 6th Panzer Division. They'll be here by morning." The villagers exchanged uneasy looks. Someone asked, "Where are our soldiers? Where's the army?" The corporal hesitated before answering. "The line's broken at Sedan. There is no line anymore." A silence fell over them, not the calm kind, but the heavy, choking silence of realization. They were on their own. Henri spat into the dirt. "Then we'll have to make our own line." Laughter, brief and uncertain, flickered around the group. But Henri wasn't joking. His eyes, squinting toward the east, weren't the eyes of a man surrendering. They were the eyes of a man calculating. He'd seen what tanks could do in the Great War, the monstrous British Mark IVs lumbering across muddy fields in 1918. He also knew what the land could do to a tank. Soft soil. Steep ditches. Deep trenches. A tank might be made of steel, but it still obeyed the earth. "Every one of us has a plow, a pick, a shovel," Henri said, raising his voice. "This road, it's not theirs yet." The men looked to one another, uncertain but listening. Henri stepped closer to the corporal. "If we can stall them, even for a few hours, the refugees can get south. You said they're pushing through the villages. Then let's make them pay for every meter." The corporal nodded slowly. "You can't stop them," he warned. "Not with shovels." Henri smirked. "We'll see what the land says about that." That night, as the distant glow of burning towns flickered on the horizon, the farmers of Vanques went to work. The rhythmic clang of shovels and the creak of wooden carts filled the night air. By lantern light, they dug. Across the main road, Henri marked a long trench with stakes, wide enough to swallow the front of a tank, deep enough to trap it. Along the ditches, they buried barrels filled with stones and scrap iron, covered with branches and dirt. Old farm equipment, plows, wheels, chains, was repurposed into crude caltrops. "Keep it quiet," Henri whispered. "They'll hear the engines soon enough." By dawn, their hands bled and their backs screamed, but the ground bore their defiance, a patchwork of trenches, obstacles, and false roads. Henri stood on the ridge, wiping the sweat from his brow, as the first rays of morning touched the horizon. And then they heard it, the rumble of engines returning, closer now, heavier. The Panzer Division was coming. Henri turned to the men beside him. "Get to cover. Let's see if they like our hospitality." The villagers disappeared into barns, haystacks, and cellars. A moment later, the first German motorcycle scouts appeared at the bend of the road, their black helmets gleaming in the morning sun. One of them slowed, spotting the churned-up earth ahead. He signaled back to the armored column, a precise, sharp gesture. Henri crouched behind a low stone wall, heart pounding. He watched as the first Panzer, a grey Panzer III with the black cross of the Wehrmacht painted on its hull, rolled forward cautiously. Its engine growled. The machine advanced another few meters. And then the ground gave way. The tank's nose dipped violently, its front treads plunging into the concealed trench. Metal screamed. The rear lifted, the turret jammed, and the engine stalled in a plume of smoke. Henry's breath caught. The entire column halted. German officers shouted orders. A second tank tried to maneuver around, and struck a hidden pit lined with scrap iron, bursting its right tread. Panic rippled through the convoy. Henri looked at the men hiding nearby and whispered, "Now they know what French soil can do." For a moment, the village was silent, only the metallic groaning of the trapped panzers filled the air. Then, the sharp, angry crack of German orders broke the stillness. "Raus! Vorwärts! Clear the road!" The tank crews scrambled out of their hatches, shouting to one another as they assessed the damage. Two vehicles sat half-buried, their front armor plates tilted at grotesque angles. Another Panzer tried to back up, its treads grinding and spitting dirt, but the soft soil gave way beneath it. Henri crouched lower behind the stone wall, his fingers pressing into the earth. Every muscle in his body trembled, not from fear, but from the violent rush of adrenaline. He hadn't expected it to work that well. From across the field, the young French corporal, Etienne, peered through a pair of cracked binoculars. "Mon Dieu, you've stopped them." "Not for long," Henri muttered. "They'll bring engineers." He was right. Within minutes, a group of German pioneers, combat engineers in grey uniforms, jumped from half-tracks. They began unrolling cables, hammering boards, and shouting for equipment. Their officers barked orders with mechanical precision, as if reading from a manual on how to crush a village. But this wasn't a field they'd practiced on. As the first engineer stepped into the mud near the trench, the ground beneath him collapsed, revealing a pit filled with broken plows, chains, and jagged iron. He screamed as he fell, disappearing into the tangle. The Germans froze. Henri closed his eyes for a second. He hadn't meant to kill anyone, but he also knew that the alternative, doing nothing, would have meant death for all of them. Etienne grabbed his sleeve. "We can hit them now. I have 3 men left with rifles." Henri hesitated. Firing would reveal their positions. But every second of confusion was a second bought. And every second mattered. "Wait for the smoke," Henri said. "When they burn the field, shoot from the barns. Make them think there are more of us." Etienne nodded and crawled off through the grass. The Germans, realizing they'd rolled into a maze of hidden obstacles, began clearing the road with their half-tracks. One of the drivers gunned his engine, the vehicle lurching forward to tow a stranded Panzer out of the ditch. The tow cable tightened, then snapped with a metallic crack. The half-track's rear wheels spun wildly, digging deeper into the soft mud. Henri allowed himself a grim smile. He'd plowed that very stretch of road for decades. He knew where the ground was strongest, and where it would swallow a machine whole. From the woods, a lone crow called out, startled by the echo of gunfire. Etienne's men had opened fire. Bullets rattled against armor plates. The Germans ducked for cover, returning bursts of machine gun fire toward the barns. Hay exploded into clouds of dust. A barn door splintered under the impact. Henri pressed his back to the stone wall, clutching his shovel like a weapon. His mind raced, not with fear, but with calculation. There were still traps they hadn't triggered, the hollow culvert under the bridge, the loose stones by the riverbank, the buried barrels that lined the roadside. He motioned to 2 of the older men beside him, Jacques and Pierre, both former poilus from the Great War. "Get to the bridge," Henri whispered. "Pull the barrel plug when you see smoke. Flood the crossing." Jacques nodded without hesitation. Like Verdun, he muttered. As they crawled away, the sound of distant engines grew louder, more tanks approaching. The column stretched far beyond the bend, dozens of vehicles idling, waiting for orders. The Germans were angry now. Their commander, a stocky major with a scar across his cheek, paced back and forth beside a half-track, shouting at his radio operator. Henri could almost hear the fury in his tone, a single French village holding up an armored division. The major slammed his fist against the vehicle's side. "Bring the Flampanzer forward." Henry's eyes widened. "Flame tank," he breathed. Etienne's voice came through the static of chaos. "Henri. They're bringing one of the fuel tanks up." The blackened snout of the modified Panzer crept around the corner, twin nozzles gleaming in the sunlight. Behind it trailed a hose connected to a fuel reservoir. Henri knew what was coming. He turned and shouted, "Get everyone back. Into the cellars." Before the words left his mouth, a tongue of fire erupted from the tank's nozzle, sweeping across the field like a living creature. The nearest barn went up instantly, flames curling around the wooden beams, smoke rising like a signal flare to the heavens. Etienne and his men dove for cover. The Germans advanced behind the wall of fire, assuming the defenders were finished. But they'd forgotten the river. Down by the bridge, Jacques and Pierre reached the buried barrels. Water seeped through the earth from a nearby canal, the same one that fed Henry's fields. Jacques jammed his crowbar into the stopper and twisted. The ground trembled as a torrent of water burst forth, spilling across the low-lying road. Within minutes, the entire crossing became a muddy, sucking pit. When the flame tank tried to cross, its tracks vanished beneath the muck. The rear reservoir tipped, tearing loose from the coupling, and then came the explosion. A plume of fire and black smoke towered over the valley. The Germans shouted in panic, scrambling for cover as burning fuel splashed across their line. Henri rose from behind the wall, his face illuminated by the firelight. He watched as the column dissolved into chaos, tanks reversing, trucks colliding, officers yelling into useless radios. Etienne appeared beside him, coughing through the smoke. "Henri, you did it. They're pulling back." Henri didn't answer. He just stared at the burning wreckage, his jaw set. "No," he said quietly. "They'll be back. But so will we." As the flames roared and the sky turned red with smoke, the villagers of Vanques, farmers, laborers, and old soldiers, had done what no army could that day, they'd stopped a panzer division in its tracks. But the battle for their home was far from over. By sunset, the sky over Vanques burned the color of rust. Smoke from the shattered tanks drifted low over the fields, mixing with the smell of scorched wheat and oil. The road, once the proud artery of the village, was now a scar, gouged and flooded, littered with debris and twisted metal. Henri stood near what remained of the stone wall, his clothes singed and his face streaked with soot. Around him, the villagers moved like ghosts, silent, dazed, blackened by smoke. Somewhere behind them, a cow bellowed weakly in a burning barn. Etienne approached, limping. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, but it hung uselessly, the barrel warped from the heat. "The fire's spreading east," he said. "If the wind turns, it'll reach the houses." Henri nodded slowly. "Then we turn the wind." He pointed toward the old irrigation channel, a narrow ditch that once carried water from the river to the upper fields. "Open the sluice," he said. "Flood it all if we must. Better mud than ashes." Etienne blinked. "But the fields." Henri cut him off. "The wheat can grow again. The people cannot." They moved quickly, gathering men to unseal the old water gates. As the sluices opened, cold river water surged across the blackened soil, hissing as it met the flames. Steam rose in thick, white clouds, blotting out the orange glow. The fire receded, leaving behind a landscape of charred stubble and glistening mud. For a brief moment, there was calm, the kind of eerie stillness that comes after a storm. But Henri knew it wouldn't last. From the far ridge, the sound of engines stirred again. The Germans hadn't given up. Through the haze, Henri saw them, trucks and half-tracks forming a perimeter. The division had halted for repairs, but now, reinforced by fresh units, they were reorganizing. Spotlights swept across the fields, cutting through the smoke like white knives. Searchlights, Etienne whispered. They're looking for survivors. Henri motioned for everyone to get down. No fires. No sound. Move through the orchards. The villagers scattered quietly, ducking into the shadows of apple trees and hedgerows. Children were carried in silence. Horses were unhitched and left to wander. The air was thick with fear, not of death, but of discovery. Henri and Etienne took position near the old church at the hill's edge. From there, they could see the entire valley below, lit in flashes by German flares. Soldiers moved methodically, sweeping the road and checking every ditch. "They'll come here next," Etienne murmured. Henri didn't reply. He watched as a group of Germans reached the first trench, the one that had trapped the leading Panzer that morning. They surrounded it, shining their torches inside. A moment later, one soldier shouted something in German. Another fired a pistol into the trench. Henri's jaw tightened. "They're killing the wounded." Etienne's hand shook on his rifle. "We can't let them. We can't fight them head-on," Henri interrupted. "Not now. We have to make them think we've gone." He turned to the villagers nearby. "Everyone to the cellars under the church. Take only what you can carry." Quietly. The villagers obeyed, slipping into the old stone crypt beneath the chapel. Henri stayed behind at the entrance, peering through a broken window at the advancing Germans. The night was alive with sound, the metallic clatter of treads, shouted orders, the hiss of fire still smoldering on the fields. Then came the heavy rumble of artillery. Henri felt it before he heard it, a distant tremor, like thunder rolling beneath the ground. A second later, the ridge to the south erupted in light. German howitzers, positioned miles away, began shelling the village. The first shell hit the outskirts, throwing up a geyser of mud and timber. The second landed closer, so close that the shockwave shattered the church's stained glass window. "Down!" Henri shouted, diving behind the altar as debris rained down. Inside the crypt, children screamed as the stone ceiling trembled. Etienne tried to calm them, his voice hoarse. "It's all right, the church will hold." But even he didn't believe it. Another shell struck the roof. Dust poured from the rafters. A statue of Saint Michael toppled, shattering against the floor. Henri crawled toward the trapdoor leading below. "Stay calm," he called. "It's stone, we'll be safe here." And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the shelling stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Henri waited, heart hammering. He could hear the faint crunch of boots outside, dozens of them. German voices, closer now. "They're coming," Etienne whispered. Henri exhaled slowly, gripping the rusted shovel still in his hand. "Then we meet them like farmers." He pushed open the cellar hatch and slipped out into the smoky night. The village square was unrecognizable, a wasteland of rubble and embers. Yet in the faint light of the burning barns, Henri saw movement, German soldiers advancing cautiously, rifles raised, checking each ruin for survivors. Henri ducked behind the stone well, eyes darting to the side. Something caught his attention, the heavy cart they'd used earlier, now half buried in debris, its wheels broken but its load intact. It was filled with sacks of lime, caustic powder used for the fields. A dangerous idea flickered in his mind. He tore open one of the sacks and let the wind carry the white dust into the air. The Germans, moving through the haze, began coughing and shielding their eyes. Henri grabbed a second bag, ripping it open and hurling it toward a burning beam. The lime met the flame, and ignited in a violent white flash. The explosion tore through the square, engulfing two of the approaching soldiers. Chaos erupted. The Germans shouted in panic, firing blindly into the smoke. Henri seized the moment. "Now," he yelled. Etienne and the remaining villagers poured from the crypt, hurling stones, bottles, anything they could find. It wasn't a battle, it was desperation made flesh. The Germans, confused and half-blinded, fell back toward the road, firing as they retreated. By the time the dust cleared, the square was empty again, save for Henri, standing amid the ruin, chest heaving. The villagers had slipped into the woods under cover of darkness. He turned once more to look at his home, what was left of it, and whispered, "You've done your part, old friend." Behind him, the church bell, cracked and half-melted, gave one final, hollow toll in the wind. The village of Vank had fallen silent. But the legend of what happened there that night, how a handful of farmers had stopped the German war machine with earth, fire, and will, was just beginning to spread. Morning crept in with the slow melancholy of smoke after rain. The fires had burned themselves out during the night, leaving only the scent of ash and iron drifting through the valley. What once was Vank now stood as a skeleton, chimneys and stone walls rising like gravestones from the blackened soil. Henri and Etienne crouched among the reeds of the riverbank, mud streaked across their faces, their clothes still damp from the night's escape. Around them, a dozen villagers huddled in silence. The children stared at the horizon, too tired to cry. Henri watched the road above, now a twisted line of destruction. German soldiers moved cautiously among the wrecks, towing damaged tanks and clearing the last of the obstacles. The black crosses on the steel hulls gleamed under the pale light of dawn. "They'll raise what's left," Etienne said quietly. "To make an example." Henri nodded. "That's what armies do when they lose to farmers." He picked up a clump of soil and crumbled it between his fingers. The ground was still warm, the texture gritty with soot. "The land remembers," he muttered. "Even if they try to bury us, the land remembers." The men and women around him said nothing. Some prayed. Others just stared. The exhaustion of survival had set in, a numbness deeper than fear. Etienne's voice broke the silence. "We can head south, Henri. There are convoys moving toward Dijon. Maybe we can reach them before the Germans cut the road." Henri didn't answer right away. His eyes lingered on the village, or what remained of it, the farmhouse, the church, the fields he had sowed every spring since he was a boy. Everything he had ever built was gone. And yet, something in him refused to move. "Go if you must," he said finally. "But I stay. Someone must see what they do next. Someone must tell it." Etienne frowned. "You'll be killed." "Maybe," Henri said softly. "But maybe not. The Germans think we're beaten. Let them think it. The land still fights with me." Before Etienne could protest, they heard voices, German, coming closer, echoing down the slope. "Patrouille. Durchsuchen den Fluss. Patrols." The villagers froze. Henri motioned for them to stay low, then gestured toward the reeds. "Into the water. Slowly. Stay quiet." They slid silently into the shallow river, the cold biting into their skin. The current was sluggish, thick with mud and ash, but it would mask their scent and sound. Henri took the rear, gripping his shovel, his only weapon, tight in his hand. The Germans reached the ridge moments later. Through the reeds, Henri saw them, 6 soldiers, rifles slung, scanning the banks. One of them pointed toward the far side of the river, where faint footprints led into the marsh. They followed the trail, the wrong trail. Henri exhaled silently, watching them disappear into the fog. When the last boot step faded, he looked back to the villagers. "Keep moving downstream. Don't stop until the hills." Etienne shook his head. "What about you?" Henri smiled faintly. Someone has to cover the trail. Before Etienne could argue, Henri slipped away, crawling up the embankment. The mud pulled at his boots, the weight of exhaustion dragging at his every movement. But he didn't stop until he reached the edge of the ruined road. The Germans were still there, repairing what they could. Mechanics shouted, engines roared to life, and the once proud Panzer column began to inch forward again, limping, scarred, but moving. Henri crouched behind a shattered tree stump and watched them. Each machine bore the marks of the previous day's battle, twisted armor, scorched paint, missing treads. Even in victory, they looked beaten. He smiled bitterly. So you move again, eh? But slower this time. Much slower. Then, something caught his eye, the lead tank, the one they'd pulled free from the trench. It was being towed by two others, its turret jammed sideways. A German officer stood nearby, supervising. His uniform was immaculate, his boots spotless despite the mud. Henri recognized him from the day before, the same major with the scar across his cheek. The major barked orders to his men, gesturing angrily toward the village ruins. One soldier handed him a captured French flag, tattered and soot-stained. The officer stared at it for a moment, then dropped it into the mud and crushed it beneath his heel. Henri's jaw clenched. Something inside him, a raw, stubborn spark, refused to let that stand. He looked down at the shovel in his hands, then at the collapsed culvert beside the road. The engineers had cleared most of the rubble, but the old waterway still gurgled faintly beneath it. He had one last idea. Moving silently, he crawled toward the culvert's mouth, where the broken barrel from the night before still leaked fuel into the ditch. He took a torn strip of cloth from his sleeve, dipped it into the oily water, and wrapped it around a splintered branch. The Germans were too busy shouting over engines to notice him. Henri struck the flint from his pocket. Once. Twice. The third time, the rag caught. A tiny, wavering flame flickered to life. He looked once more at the burning ruins of his village, then shoved the torch deep into the fuel-slick mud. The explosion was small at first, a dull thump that rolled through the culvert. Then the earth itself seemed to roar. The buried fuel ignited in a chain reaction, racing beneath the road. The ground erupted beneath the lead Panzer. Steel and mud shot skyward in a geyser of fire. The shockwave knocked men off their feet and sent the column reeling backward. Henri was thrown hard against the embankment, the world spinning in smoke and light. When his vision cleared, he saw the major, thrown to the ground, shouting in rage and disbelief. The column halted again. The mighty 6th Panzer Division, once an unstoppable spear through France, was now stalled by one farmer's final act of defiance. Henri, bleeding from a cut on his temple, crawled back toward the reeds. Etienne and the villagers were already far downstream, their figures barely visible in the mist. He looked back at the wrecked road, at the broken machines, and at the flag still half buried in the mud. Slowly, painfully, he stood, and raised his hand in a silent salute. Then he turned and disappeared into the reeds. Behind him, the German major stared at the burning road in silence. He didn't understand how, or why, a handful of peasants had delayed his advance for nearly 2 days. But history would. Because when the war was over, when the maps were redrawn and the fields grew golden once more, the story of Vank would travel, whispered among soldiers, passed through villages, retold by refugees. They would say, a farmer stopped a Panzer division. With nothing but the land, his will, and a shovel. And in that truth, buried in the mud and blood of June 1940, France found its first spark of resistance.